The night was thick with silence, the kind that presses down on your chest and makes every sound feel louder than it should be. The streets were nearly deserted, save for the occasional flicker of a streetlight struggling to stay alive. It was well past midnight, a time when most people were tucked away in their homes, leaving the city to the shadows and the quiet hum of distant life. The air was cold and damp, carrying with it a faint scent of rain that had fallen earlier, leaving puddles that reflected the faint glow of the street lamps. I was behind the wheel of my car, tired from a long day, but eager to get home and escape the creeping unease that had been building all evening. The familiar roads I usually took felt too ordinary tonight, almost like they were closing in on me. On a whim, I decided to take a different route, a shortcut through the older, less traveled part of town. It was a place I had heard stories about, whispers of things best left alone after dark, but curiosity and a restless mind pushed me forward. As I drove deeper into this neglected area, the atmosphere shifted. The buildings were older, their facades worn and cracked, with windows dark and empty, like eyes that had long stopped watching. The sidewalks were uneven, and trash scattered here and there hinted that no one cared to keep this place alive. The streetlights here were fewer and farther between, and their flickering made the shadows dance in ways that played tricks on my eyes. Every turn seemed to lead me farther into a world that felt disconnected from the city I knew, a world that belonged to the night. The road was narrow and winding, lined by tall, gnarled trees whose branches stretched over the asphalt like skeletal fingers. Their leaves rustled softly in the cold breeze, adding to the eerie symphony of the night. My headlights barely pierced the darkness beyond a few feet ahead, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching from just beyond the reach of the light. My grip tightened on the steering wheel, my senses sharpening as every small noise, the crunch of gravel under tires, the distant hoot of an owl, seemed amplified. I passed an old, abandoned bus stop, its sign rusted and barely readable. The bench beneath it was worn and splintered, and the shelter's roof sagged as if weighed down by years of neglect. It was a place people used to wait, but now it stood as a forgotten relic, swallowed by shadows and time. As I slowed down to take in the scene, a movement caught my eye. A figure standing at the edge of the shelter, barely visible in the dim light. She was a woman, her form slender and hunched against the cold. Her clothes were soaked, clinging, to her as if she had been out in the rain for hours. Her hair was dark and tangled, partially covering a face pale and drawn, with eyes that seemed distant, as if she was somewhere far away from that lonely street. For a moment, I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to keep driving, to leave this forgotten part of town and its strange passenger behind. But something about her vulnerability, or maybe the loneliness mirrored in her eyes, made me slow to a stop. The car door opened with a soft click, and she stepped inside without a word. The door shut gently behind her, sealing us in a bubble of silence that felt thick and heavy. As I resumed driving, the weight of the night settled deeper around us. The streets seemed even darker now, and the shadows grew longer, reaching for the edges of my vision. The familiar hum of the engine was drowned out by the pounding of my heart, each beat echoing in my ears. I glanced over at the passenger seat, but she stared out the window, her gaze fixed on something beyond the glass, lost in a world I couldn't see. The shortcut I had chosen felt like a passage into another realm, where time slowed and the ordinary rules no longer applied. The silence was not just the absence of sound, but something more. A presence waiting, watching, lingering just out of reach. My mind raced with questions I didn't dare ask, and the road stretched endlessly before me, promising that this last ride of the night was far from over. The night air was thick with an unsettling stillness as I approached the old bus stop, the one that stood alone on the edge of the forgotten part of town. The flickering street lamp above cast a weak, wavering light that barely reached the worn bench beneath the shelter. I slowed the car instinctively, my eyes catching a glimpse of movement in the shadows. That's when I saw her. a woman standing there, shrouded in darkness, yet illuminated faintly by the sickly yellow glow of the lamp. She looked out of place, like a ghost misplaced in time. Her clothes were soaked through, clinging to her thin frame as if she'd been caught in a sudden downpour. The fabric was torn in places, hinting at some unknown struggle or hardship. Her hair hung in wet strands around her pale, almost translucent face. Despite the cold, she didn't shiver. Instead, she stood perfectly still, staring down the road as if waiting for something that would never come. There was something deeply unsettling about her presence, something that sent a shiver racing down my spine. She didn't move when I stopped the car, didn't wave or call out. It was as if she was trapped in a moment outside of time, suspended in the shadows like a forgotten memory. My heart thudded in my chest, each beat louder than the last, echoing the growing sense of unease. The street was empty. No cars passed by. No sounds of life stirred in the distance. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves in the wind and the soft drip of water from the shelter's roof. She turned slightly, her eyes catching the light for just a second, revealing an emptiness that was almost otherworldly. It was as if she had seen things no one else could. Horrors so deep they had drained the life from her eyes. For a moment, I considered driving past, leaving her to whatever fate had left her stranded here. But something about her made me hesitate, a strange pull that I couldn't explain. Maybe it was pity or curiosity, or a desperate hope that she wasn't as lost as she looked. Against every warning my mind screamed at me, I unlocked the door and gestured for her to get in. She moved toward the car with slow, deliberate steps, her wet shoes making no sound on the cracked pavement. When she climbed inside, the door closed behind her with a soft thud that seemed far too final. The warmth of the car enveloped us both, but it did nothing to ease the cold knot tightening in my stomach. She sat silently beside me, her hands folded. In her lap, her gaze fixed on the window as the city lights blurred past. Her presence was heavy, like a shadow pressing down inside the car. I glanced over, hoping for some sign of recognition, some clue to who she was or why she was out here at this hour. But her face remained unreadable, a mask of quiet despair. The silence between us stretched longer than felt natural. It was thick, with things unspoken, stories left untold, secrets buried deep. Every so often I caught her eyes briefly flicker toward me, only to retreat again like a frightened animal. It was clear she was carrying something, a pain or fear that wasn't hers alone. I tried to break the quiet with a question, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I focused on the road, trying to convince myself that this was just a strange coincidence, that I would soon drop her off somewhere safe and be done with the unsettling episode. But deep down, I knew this was no ordinary ride. The city behind us faded, replaced by stretches of road lined with twisted trees and darkness that seemed to swallow the headlights whole. The car's interior grew colder despite the heater's efforts, and a creeping sense of dread settled in. I glanced at her again, and this time, her eyes met mine, hollow, haunted, and filled with a silent warning I couldn't ignore. The moment she slid into the passenger seat, the atmosphere inside the car shifted. It was as if a veil of cold had descended upon the cabin, draining the warmth that had been there just moments before. The heater was still on, but a chill wrapped itself around me like an invisible hand. I glanced over, expecting to see some sign of life or recognition in her eyes, but all I found was stillness, a frozen mask that gave nothing away. She didn't speak, not a word. Her eyes remained fixed on the window, staring out into the darkness beyond. But it was clear she wasn't really seeing the world outside. There was a depth to her gaze, something distant and unreachable, as if her mind was trapped somewhere far from the cold leather seat she occupied. Her hands lay quietly in her lap, fingers slightly curled but motionless, betraying no hint of the turmoil I sensed beneath that quiet exterior. The silence between us was heavy. It wasn't peaceful or calm, it was thick with tension, the kind that presses down on your chest and makes your breathing shallow. Every little noise inside the car seemed magnified. The hum of the engine, the steady tick of the turn signal, even the faint creak of the seatbelt as I adjusted my position. But she remained still, silent. A shadow that seemed to absorb all sound and light. I wanted to break the silence, to ask her who she was or where she needed to go, but the words caught in my throat. There was something about her presence that stifled conversation, a suffocating energy that made it impossible to speak. Instead, I focused on the road, trying to steady my racing thoughts while the city lights flickered past in a blur. The car's interior suddenly felt smaller, more confining, as if the space between us was closing in. The air seemed colder, sharper, and I found myself rubbing my arms in an attempt to chase away the chill. A subtle but persistent feeling settled over me, unease that went beyond simple discomfort. It was a creeping dread, a warning whispered by every nerve in my body. I caught a glimpse of her reflection in the rearview mirror. For a fleeting second, I thought I saw something move behind her, something dark and formless that disappeared. The moment I blinked, my heart leapt, and I quickly focused back on the road, telling myself it was just a trick of the light, a product of my tired mind playing games. The radio, which had been quietly playing static, suddenly crackled louder, then cut out completely. The silence that followed was absolute, heavier than before. I reached to turn it off, but the dial felt frozen under my fingers. It was as if the car itself was reacting to her presence, rejecting any attempt to fill the void with noise. Outside, the world seemed to close in. The familiar shapes of houses and trees faded into shadows that pressed against the windows, dark and silent. The night air seeped in through cracks I couldn't find, chilling the car from within. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end as the silence grew deeper, broken only by the sound of my own breathing. I stole another glance at her. Her face was still turned away, but now and then I caught the faintest tremble in her shoulders, as if some unseen weight was pressing down on her. There was a sadness there, something ancient and raw that tugged at something deep inside me, stirring a mix of pity and fear. Despite the cold and the silence, I found myself unable to turn back, unable to stop the car and leave her alone on that deserted road. Something about her presence was magnetic, pulling me deeper into this strange, unsettling journey. The night stretched on, and the shadows outside seemed to grow thicker, swallowing the light and time itself, as if this ride was moving through a place beyond the normal world. As I continued driving through the empty streets, the car began to behave in ways that made my skin crawl. The radio, which had been silent for a while, suddenly crackled to life with static, the white noise filling the confined space like a bad omen. I reached to turn it off, but the dial didn't respond. The volume kept rising and falling unpredictably, as if controlled by some unseen force. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the static gave way to eerie whispers. Soft, unintelligible voices that sent a shiver down my spine. I glanced at the woman beside me, but she remained motionless, staring blankly out the window. Her presence seemed to feed the strange energy in the car, intensifying every odd sensation. The heater, which had been keeping the cold at bay, suddenly faltered. The air turned icy, and my breath became visible in front of me, despite the car's internal temperature. I rubbed my arms, trying to shake the chill, but it clung to me stubbornly, as if the cold wasn't just from the environment, but something far darker. The GPS on the dashboard flickered erratically. The route I had set vanished from the screen, replaced by a pulsing blankness that made it impossible to tell where I was headed. The familiar, comforting voice of the navigation system was gone, replaced by silence that felt heavy and oppressive. I tried to reset the device, but the screen remained black, stubbornly refusing to come back to life. In the rearview mirror, I thought I saw a shadow move. At first, it was just a vague flicker, something out of the corner of my eye, but then it became clearer, a dark shape that seemed to linger just behind the woman. I jerked my head around to look, but the back seat was empty. My heart pounded harder as I kept stealing glances at the mirror, each time catching fleeting images of something that wasn't there moments before. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, but the darkness beyond seemed unnatural, thicker, almost swallowing the light whole. The trees lining the street bent in strange angles, their branches reaching out like grasping hands. Every now and then, I thought I heard whispers carried on the wind, voices too faint to understand but full of sorrow and warning. Inside the car, the tension grew unbearable. The usual hum of the engine sounded distant, almost as if I were underwater. The air felt charged, alive with something malevolent. I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter, knuckles white, as if holding on physically could keep whatever was happening at bay. The woman beside me suddenly shifted slightly, but her face remained turned away. I caught a glimpse of her profile in the side mirror. Her skin looked almost translucent, and the shadows beneath her eyes deepened, as if something was draining her life away. The contrast between her stillness and the chaos around us made the scene all the more surreal. The car's windows fogged up suddenly, despite the heater running. My breath misted against the glass as I watched patterns form, strange shapes that twisted and writhed before disappearing. I wiped the window, but the fog returned almost immediately, as if the cold was seeping through every crack and crevice. Then came the silence, a heavy, suffocating silence that pressed down on me from all sides. The whispers stopped, the static vanished, and even the cold seemed to pause. For a brief moment, the only sound was the rhythmic beating of my heart, loud and insistent in the quiet. The ride felt suspended in time, caught between reality and something far darker. Every instinct told me to stop, to turn back, but my hands refused to move. I was trapped in this strange, frozen moment, driving deeper into a nightmare where the boundaries between the living and the unseen began to blur. As the road stretched ahead, twisting into darkness, the woman finally broke her silence. Her voice was barely more than a whisper, fragile and cold, yet it cut through the thick silence of the car like a sharpened blade. "This is where the ride ends," she said, her words hanging in the air, heavy and final. The simple sentence carried a weight I couldn't quite understand, as if it marked the boundary between the world I knew and something far more sinister. I looked over at her, startled by the suddenness of her speech. Her eyes met mine briefly. Deep, dark pools that seemed to reflect a sorrow older than time itself. There was no anger, no plea for help, only a quiet resignation, as if she had been waiting for this moment, for this exact place. I wanted to ask her what she meant. Why here? But the words caught in my throat, swallowed by the cold knot of fear tightening in my chest. The car slowed instinctively, the engine's hum dropping to a low murmur. Outside, the night seemed to hold its breath. The shadows on either side of the road stretched longer, reaching across the asphalt like fingers, trying to pull the light away. The air grew colder still, the chill creeping through the windows and settling inside the car, wrapping around us like a shroud. I glanced ahead, trying to see what lay at the end of this stretch of road. The headlights cut through the darkness, revealing a small clearing bordered by twisted trees that seemed to lean inward, their branches tangled like the fingers of a clawed hand. In the center stood something I couldn't immediately identify, a figure draped in shadow, motionless and waiting. The woman's gaze didn't waver from the dark figure. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, she looked almost peaceful, as if she had found what she was searching for. The silence was so complete it pressed against my eardrums, broken only by the faint sound of my own breathing and the distant rustle of leaves. Then, without warning, she was gone. It wasn't a sudden disappearance or a quick movement. It was as if she had simply dissolved into the air, leaving behind nothing but the faintest trace of cold that lingered long after she was gone. The seat beside me was empty, the car suddenly too large, too quiet. I reached out instinctively, fingers brushing the cold leather where she had sat just moments before. The chill that seeped into my skin was unnatural, like the touch of something not meant for the living world. Panic surged through me, and I slammed on the brakes, bringing the car to an abrupt stop in the middle of the road. Heart pounding, I turned in my seat to look behind me. The rearview mirror reflected only darkness and the empty back seat. No sign of her, no trace of the strange presence that had filled the car just moments before. It was as if she had never been there at all. The night around me felt different now, thicker, heavier, as if the very air had changed. The shadows seemed to pulse with unseen life, and the silence was broken by a distant sound, faint but unmistakable. A slow, deliberate knocking. It echoed from somewhere deep in the darkness beyond the trees, a sound that sent a cold wave of dread crashing through me. I wanted to believe it was a trick of the mind, a nightmare blending with reality, but the knocking grew louder, closer, a steady rhythm that matched the pounding of my heart. The last ride of the night had come to its end, but what waited beyond was something I couldn't yet understand, something that whispered promises of darkness and forever. The knocking continued, slow and rhythmic, echoing through the stillness like a heartbeat from the darkness itself. I sat frozen in the driver's seat, my eyes fixed on the blackness beyond the windshield. The night had transformed into something unrecognizable, no longer just a backdrop of shadows, but a living, breathing entity pressing in from all sides. The trees bent closer, their twisted limbs like claws reaching out to grasp the fragile thread of light my headlights provided. My hands trembled as I reached for the door handle, desperate to escape whatever presence now filled the clearing. But the moment my fingers touched the cold metal, the knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence so thick it seemed to smother the very air inside the car. The sudden absence was almost worse than the noise. It was as if the night itself was holding its breath, waiting for something unseen to make its next move. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my racing heart. The windows were fogged up again, the condensation swirling into strange, twisting shapes that seemed to shift and writhe with a life of their own. The patterns looked like symbols, ancient and unknowable, etched by some invisible hand onto the glass. I wiped at the fog frantically, but it only returned, creeping faster and thicker, obscuring my view of the world outside. A chill swept through the car, colder than anything I'd felt before, as if the very temperature had dropped into the depths of winter. My breath came out in shaky puffs, visible in the dim light, a reminder that the warmth of life was slipping away. Then, a faint whisper floated through the air, soft, distant, but unmistakably there. It was a voice, or perhaps many voices, speaking in a language I couldn't understand, full of sorrow and warning. The sensation of being watched grew stronger. I glanced in the rearview mirror again, half expecting to see the woman's face, staring back at me. Instead, I caught a glimpse of movement, something dark and shifting just beyond the edge of the glass. My heart leapt and I spun around in my seat, but the back of the car was empty. No sign of her, no hint of the shadowy figure from the clearing. Desperation clawed at me as I fumbled for the keys in the ignition, trying to start the engine, but the car remained silent. The dashboard lights flickered weakly, then went out entirely, plunging me into darkness. The only illumination came from the faint glow of the street lamp behind me, casting long, eerie shadows that danced across the trees and ground. The oppressive silence returned, thicker and more suffocating than before. My mind raced, desperate to make sense of the nightmare unfolding around me. Every instinct screamed to flee, to escape this place that seemed to exist outside the laws of reality. But I was trapped, caught in a moment that stretched endlessly, where time itself felt warped and distorted. Then, out of the silence, came a soft tapping, gentle, deliberate, coming from the passenger side window. I froze, staring at the glass, as if willing it to reveal the source of the sound. The tapping grew louder, more urgent, and I could make out faint outlines pressed against the fogged glass, shapes that looked like fingers, long and thin, tapping in a slow, steady rhythm. Panic surged through me, and I fumbled for the door, locks, but they didn't respond. The car was sealed shut, a cage trapping me inside with whatever was waiting just beyond the glass. The tapping continued, relentless and insistent, like a warning or a summons from the darkness. My breath quickened, and sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cold. The last ride of the night was no longer just a journey through a quiet city. It had become a descent into a realm where shadows whispered secrets and the living and the dead blurred into one. The unknown waited patiently, knocking at the boundary between worlds, demanding that I face whatever lay beyond the veil.